Today we're going to talk about goals and goal orientation. Let's start with our guiding questions. How do goals influence motivation and learning? What are characteristics of effective goals? What are key concepts in goal orientation theory? What principles and implementation strategies align with goal orientation theory? And then finally, how do we assess goal orientation? So starting with, how do goals influence motivation? So how do goals influence motivation and learning? We know that goals influence our behavior. So they influence our effort, how much effort we're willing to put into a task. They influence our persistence, or how long we'll stick with a task. They direct attention, meaning that they influence what we pay attention to. They influence how strategic we are in our planning. And they give us a reference point to know how we're doing compared to the goals that we've set. Let's just remind ourselves from our unit on social, cognitive, and self-regulation that there are different types of goals, and an important characteristic of goals is whether they're SMART goals. So when we talk about the content of goals, remember that we talk about whether they're specific, whether they're measurable, whether they're action-oriented, realistic, timely. These are the features of SMART goals that are very important to think about and keep in mind as you consider goal theory and goal orientation. Also, thinking about goal setting strategies, we encourage people to set specific and measurable performance goals, and we use cooperative and collaborative groups to allow for opportunities to attain both social and academic goals. So we have individual, social, academic goals. These are some of the different types of goals that affect our goal setting strategies. What are key concepts in goal orientation theory? In the motivation literature, we look at goal orientation as a major influence on motivation. Goal orientation is the stance that a learner takes when engaging with a learning task. So rather than focusing on the content of the goal itself, as we did in SMART goals, goal orientation theory addresses why individuals engage in a particular task and how they approach that task and engage with that task. So from the goal orientation literature, we make a major distinction between mastery goals and performance goals. Mastery goals typically focus on just the joy of learning in and of itself. And it's that sense of satisfaction that you get from mastering a particular task or mastering some content. You know, just the desire to improve yourself and how rewarding that can be. In contrast, performance goals focus much more on ability and judgments of performance relative to others, rather than how you did on a task in some abstract sense. An important consideration is whether or not a learner's goal orientation leads them to either approach or avoid engaging in a task. Pintridge designed this 2x2 framework that looks at both, whether you have adopted a mastery or a performance goal orientation, and whether you are either approaching or avoiding a task. So we'll walk through this chart. So to begin, a mastery orientation with an approach focus, that means that you'd be focused on mastering the task, doing whatever you can to engage with it, to use good strategies for learning, to improve your progress on it and your understanding. So you are approaching the learning task, going for it with a mastery orientation, an orientation to learn the material. But unfortunately, a mastery orientation can also come with an avoidance focus. And that is you're avoiding misunderstanding, avoiding not learning the material. Maybe you're afraid you're not going to be able to do it. You're not going to master it. So you may be using standards of not wanting to be wrong. So you may have an interest in mastering the task, but unfortunately, you may still avoid the task. Now let's look at performance orientations. So performance orientations focus on besting others, demonstrating your superiority to others, being the brightest in the class. So if you can approach the task, but you approach it from a performance orientation, meaning that you want to sort of show off that you're the best. You want that gold star, you want to be the top of the list, you want to get the highest grade. That doesn't necessarily result in great performance on the learning task ultimately. Finally, you can be performance oriented and avoid the task. This is when you really are concerned about performance orientation. You want to look good, but you're afraid you won't. So now you want to avoid the task because you don't want to look bad in comparison to others. And you might just adopt some sort of self-defeating strategy here, like just failing to study at all or failing to even show up for an exam. Performance orientation from an avoid focus is probably the worst of the four in terms of positive learning outcome. What principles and implementation strategies align with goal orientation theory? Well, here are some of the principles that can guide your choice of solutions to address goal orientation issues. And these are really focused on helping learners acquire a mastery goal orientation, which is the most adaptive for learning. So you really want to help students approach tasks, focus on mastery, and recognize the role of their effort. And we know that it's better to reinforce effort than to reinforce performance. In other words, it's great to say, hey, I see you're trying really hard on this task, or I see that you're trying harder on this task than you did previously, rather than focusing on the grade by saying, oh, I see that you got a better grade. You really want to keep evaluation private anyway, not public. You really want to decrease that performance orientation. You really don't want to be sharing grades across students and emphasizing that comparison to other students. You want to focus on the meaningful aspects of learning, and that helps them to adopt a mastery orientation. And you want to design learning tasks that are novel, varied, diverse, interesting. That keeps people in a mastery orientation where they want to learn and they want to approach a task. So when you think about applying goal orientation theory, hopefully most of us want to create learners that have a mastery orientation and an approach orientation. So some of the things you might do as a teacher is that you might think about diagnosing the attributes of a particular learning situation and focus on meaningful aspects of learning. Designing a task for novelty and variety, making it interesting, focusing less on compliance with the task, focusing less on students' performance on the task from a grade standpoint. Designing tasks that are challenging but reasonable, giving students opportunities for choice and control, focusing on improvement, effort, learning, progress, mastery. Striving to keep evaluation private, not public, not comparing students one to another in terms of grade, and recognizing students for their effort. So teachers and supervisors, employers, again, they can all provide feedback to a learner that gives clues about the type of goal orientation that's operating in a given context. And they can also lead learners towards a goal orientation that's consistent with mastery and approach rather than consistent with performance and avoid. So in terms of applying goal orientation, we can see that students can view their mistakes and challenges as opportunities for relearning or learning more and mastery. So put failure in a very different light. Can also take grading to a whole different orientation as well. You can use heterogeneous cooperative groups, fostering interaction among individuals, using an individual's work to convey progress, making sure students have time, students or employees have time to avoid these crunches that make them rush through, and instead allow them time to master their material to be successful at a particular task. How do we assess goal orientation? Well, as we did with attributions, let's look briefly at how we could measure goal orientation. There are a number of different instruments that have been widely used that can assess goal orientation. And again, they're often these Likert scale survey items that ask participants to rate the degree to which they agree or disagree with statements like these here. However, you can also use more qualitative approaches by asking individuals why they're doing something in a particular way, using an open-ended question or an interview question that taps those goals that they might be employing. Then you can go back and you can categorize their responses according to these different goal orientations of mastery approach, mastery avoid, performance approach, performance avoid. And finally, refer you to the Strunk et al. Book for further information about goal orientations.